Hello, I'm Lauren O'Keefe, and I'm the coordinator of strategic initiatives at Carnegie Library of Pittsburgh. We recently hosted the Children's Literacy Summit on September 27th, a community event that brought together librarians, educators, advocates, caregivers, and community leaders through the shared belief in the power of reading. At the library, we deeply value our work of fostering literacy, making connections, and encouraging lifelong learning for all. We wanted to continue the spotlight on literacy in our conversations and learning. We are so excited that today's panel on technology and literacy will be the first of our virtual literacy panel series taking place each month through the end of the year. Looking ahead, we'll be hosting a schools and libraries panel on November 19th and Fantastic Books of 2025 to read with kids on December 3rd. Today, we will present an engaging discussion on technology and literacy, building skills for learning and careers with an incredibly esteemed lineup of panelists. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our panel moderator, Mr. Bob Longo, who is a former Apple Division President and founding CEO of Carnegie Learning. Thanks for being with us today, Bob.
Thank you, Lauren, and thanks to the Carnegie Library of Pittsburgh for hosting both the recent first literacy summit we've had in Pittsburgh for children's literacy, and also for hosting these series of webinars as a follow-up to the summit. I think our schools and our community resources, such as our libraries, have been leading the way with efforts to increase literacy with our youth. This is serviced in many ways, particularly with the science of reading approach, which is now being supported as the reading curriculum in many of our schools, and likewise in supplemental areas in and out of school buildings with after-school programs in the libraries and by groups like the Boys and Girls Clubs and YMCA's and various approaches to offering one-to-one tutoring, both human tutoring and technology-assisted tutoring. Today's panel is represented by a group of talented individuals who've dedicated their work to literacy, both in research and in practice, and likewise discovering ways to enable students and teachers with technology. In this technology-driven age, we're bombarded daily with news about advances in technology, particularly artificial intelligence. Our greater community is intrigued and concerned about its application in education, in the education of our children. It's important to note, as privacy is often a concern, that the government a while ago actually has not been absent with this regard with our younger children and put into place the COPPA, and that's COPPA law to protect children 13 and under. And I know that's always a concern about parents about student information. I'm pleased to introduce our first panelist, Dr. Laura Paparo, who's a well-known, as is her family's work with a long-time literacy network at the University of Pennsylvania, which has now been integrated into Penn's Learning Network, where Laura is the executive director. Welcome, Laura.
Thank you.
I thought maybe we'd start with a question, Laura. I know from your background that one of your interesting areas of research has been in what is known as content area literacy. And I would guess, particularly for the non-educators, that's maybe not a familiar qualification for a type of literacy. Can you tell us what's meant by content area literacy, and how might teachers and parents' understanding of it better improve our children's literacy? And likewise, I'd say any other opening comments you'd like to make about literacy and or enabling technologies, please feel free.
Yeah, thank you. So it's wonderful to be here today. I appreciate the opportunity to speak and meet with these other experts as well. So my work at the University of Pennsylvania has been supporting teachers in integrating literacy across the content in which they teach. So I am actually a trained social studies teacher. I taught high school for many years as well, and it's so important to understand that every discipline, every topic, every area of the curriculum has its own language, its own way of constructing knowledge. And content area literacy is the way that students engage with the content, the text specific that they are encountering in either a social studies class with a historical primary source document, which you read very differently than you would read poetry, or a lab directions, or something from a science classroom. So content area literacy really helps students interpret and learn to think about how to read, communicate like a scientist, like a historian, like a mathematician, like an artist, to better understand how language in that way can be constructed and is really unique and different. And the important for me, what's so important about this is that it raises up the importance of every teacher in being a teacher of reading. And we've heard this for many years, that it's everybody's responsibility to teach reading. And actually in Pennsylvania, with the new science of reading and structured literacy regulations, all teachers K to 12 are required to have training in the science of reading and structured literacy so they can teach students how to read in whatever context they're in, because we understand that sometimes students don't have all of those skills coming into our classrooms. And so in addition to, learning to read and learning the building blocks of reading, the phonics, the phonemic awareness, and all of those components, the comprehension layered on top of that, we're also thinking, how do we help students to make sense of, poetry, or the Declaration of Independence? And for me, I know thinking about technology infused in all of this is really helpful in augmenting access for students and giving them a chance to really delve in ways that they couldn't necessarily with just paper and pencil alone. So for us, it's about integrating all of those things and creating an experience for the teachers through professional development, professional learning, where they can foster a community of practitioners who are working to do this together. Because, a teacher alone in their classroom feels like this is really overwhelming work. It's a lot. And so we have to rely on one another and the support systems that exist within our schools and school districts and in higher education and in the community with the parents and other community organizations to really emphasize the need to focus on all of this together.
Great. Well, thank you. And maybe a good follow-up for Dr. Norberg, Cole, is as a cognitive scientist working for a company that offers math and reading curriculum assisted by adaptive intelligent tutoring. Um, Curiously, some of your research has been focused on reading skills and with math learning outcomes. And so when Laura talks about content based literacy, yeah, I think it's interesting that your company has a reputation for being in the math market, but some of your research has been on the reading end. And can you explain this intersection of why effective reading ability is essential to mathematics, and also tell us a little bit about the cognitive tutors that you deal with and how they personally adapt to individual learners?
Yes, absolutely. So just as we were saying a moment ago, the topic area is important. It's important for any kind of literacy. So the way reading the way a student reads when they're reading in math, it may be slightly different, or they may need different strategies than when they're reading a long narrative text like in their English class. But overall, reading is one of the main mechanisms that we use for learning. So anytime a student is going to struggle to read, they're going to struggle to learn through reading. And so this is why it's really critical for students to read at grade level, because if they're not reading at grade level and they're being provided math text that they're supposed to be learning their math through, then they're going to also fall behind in math. But we know that not all students are quite reading at grade level. And so on the other side of this, we can try to make our learning materials a little bit easier to read to support those students whose reading skills haven't quite risen to that level yet, and ensure that they're not falling behind in their math or their history class or any class just because of their reading level. So my research has really looked at this through the lens of math word problems. And I think probably everyone can relate to how difficult math word problems can be to read. These are things like two trains leave I can't say Philadelphia today. Philadelphia at 8 a.m. traveling 60 miles per hour. So even if you're a skilled reader, when you get to the end of one of these word problems, you might just feel like your head is exploding. Like, what? I can't even begin to process that. I have to really reread it. So when we're measuring in our cognitive tutor, when we're measuring, giving students a math problem, and we want to see how they solve the problem, we want to make sure that we're measuring their math skills. But if a student is struggling to solve a problem like that, is it their math skills? Are we seeing that they don't understand algebra, or are we seeing that they don't know how to parse this really complicated set of text? And we're trying to help them with their math. So we really need to kind of drill down into that. So some of the work that I've done is to try to bring math word problems down to a more appropriate reading level difficulty for these students. So we look for math problems where our struggling readers are doing worse than maybe we would expect on average on that problem. And then we try to kind of improve the reading flow of those word problems to see if it's going to help them. And sometimes it does, and sometimes it doesn't. And when it doesn't work, that leads us to another question: was it really never reading to begin with that was a barrier for this problem? Or are we actually accurately measuring the math and the students are just struggling with the math? Or is there something else that we're not picking up on that's making this difficult to read? And so that brings us to this kind of unknown area in reading, to really understand, well, what about reading in math? What about reading when it's this abstract concepts that you're trying to, these kind of false narratives about two trains leaving, and that you never have to sort of deal with in everyday life? And what makes reading comprehension so difficult then? And we don't have answers to that. So that's some of what we're trying to figure out.
Great. Well, thank you. And we'll give Conrad a shot at this next. As anyone who knows, artificial intelligence, referred to as AI, is top of mind right now. I mean, you can't turn on, listen to a program on the radio or online where they're not speaking about AI in some way. The education space is no exception, and a good bit of the research that you've participated in, Conrad, has been AI related. What insights can you offer to parents and teachers about how AI can be a positive contributor in assisting learning, and perhaps any cautions that you might also offer that they should be vigilant about?
Sure, yeah, I'm happy to speak to this, and let me preface by saying it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me. Um, so in my own research, yeah, I took a quite broad stance to literacy, and I like, for instance, how Cole has mentioned this intersection of math and reading. Now, when it comes to math, one aspect of the literacy is also knowing how to use these technology tools that aid learning, but also understanding the math vocabulary and how solutions ought to be represented, and how teachers and curricula expect students to solve math problems. And In my research, which is in human-computer interaction, we often directly work with users of these tools to understand both their struggles, but also needs and desires for these tools. And so in my own work, I've, for instance, interviewed middle school parents and caregivers to understand what their stance towards AI is and what they would need to become more involved in these tools. And so one opportunity there is to have the AI better explain the math problems that students do, for instance, in homework, and enable the parent to become involved. So one concrete example of this, which we've often heard in these interviews, is that parents sometimes struggle with new curricular standards like the Common Core and being able to understand how the math is represented, since it's different from how they were taught when they were in school. And so where AI can come in is it can help explain how the math ought to be solved. And it has a very vast, what we call knowledge base of these different math standards. And we've developed tools, for instance, now that directly interact with the software that the student engages in doing math homework and then surfaces these explanations to parents to assist their child in the homework. And so that's one aspect of a way AI can help. Now, of course, there are a lot of things to be vigilant about as well, which is kind of the second part of your point. And one thing there is AI over-reliance, where the explanations that the AI can give, for instance, large language models like ChatGPT, is that they can give very extensive explanations of the math beyond that which would help the student actually learn. So just as an example, if you're solving an equation for X in your middle school math class, and you're struggling to do a subtraction, and you prompt the ChatGPT model to explain what's going on, it might just solve all the remaining steps of the equation for you. And that takes away, let's say, the opportunity for the student to learn and understand the remaining steps. So one thing that I recommend doing, which is in line with this explanation tool that I've explained, would be for parents and caregivers to sit together with their student or child and to speak about how are we actually using ChatGPT when solving our math problem, and how is the model actually answering and responding, and how can we make sure that the student, or talking to the child directly, you can make sure to give it a fair shot first and try your best kind of solving the problem, which goes into the issues of persistence and motivation that I'm happy to talk about later as well. So yeah, that's probably what I would say just to kick us off, and I'll maybe stop there. Happy to elaborate.
Great. Yeah, it's pretty interesting. I think, because, we often think about reading as kind of a separate subject, right? You don't think about it as this horizontal platform that goes across all the content areas. I mean, it makes sense when you really dwell on it, as some of you have in your research and in your work. Laura, I guess I, while some of this is very focused on the area of tutoring, which I think both with some of the in-school, particularly technology-based programs, that's a key element. But tutoring in general is one area that I think is relevant to technology, but also to literacy in general. And while human tutoring is often found and validated in the research to be highly effective, it's often been considered difficult to scale and can be sometimes more costly. Have you discovered any effective computer-based tutors or programs that you've come across uh, that speak to perhaps reducing costs and making tutoring more available? And can this kind of intelligent tutoring uh, be an effective supplemental resource for some children? Um, Additionally, um, and more recently, there's been a lot of discussion about what's being referred to as high impact tutoring, kind of a new buzz label for one-to-one tutoring. But I think it's also interesting with that that while some of this is being delivered, or most of it is being delivered in person by professionals and also peers and volunteers. There's also companies now and other types of programs that are providing it real time online. But I guess the general question is, could you speak to tutoring and maybe its relationship to both literacy and to technology?
Yeah, yeah. And so we actually have a tutor training program at Penn, which is a federal grant where we train high school students to be peer tutors for other students across Pennsylvania. And the focus of that grant is on students in rural school districts across Pennsylvania. And there is a technology component that we utilize in both the training of the tutors and in the rollout of the actual tutoring program. What we know about tutoring is that when it's done well by somebody who's trained and knows what they're doing and can help students reason through and think through some of their confusion and provide some directed supports, really targeting what those students need, it works really, really well. As you said, it is extremely hard to scale. It's extremely expensive to scale when you're not working with volunteers, especially. And it's not the most impactful when it is kind of touch and go and a little bit at a time. What we know about it is that it works best when it's consistent, when it's targeted, and when it really approaches each individual student's needs. This is where AI can have a real foothold in providing some of the measured success or measured growth that could happen, might be between the student and some of the confusion that they're having with AI. It could help leverage the AI in creating like a first step in the tutoring so that sometimes when the tutor or the tutee has questions that maybe the tutor doesn't even, hasn't seen this before or is running into a wall, the AI can be there to provide like a first glance at some of those questions. And sometimes the things that AI can help to do would be really giving more opportunity for that tutor to work with more students and to spread that more widely. What I've seen really work really well is for AI to help the tutors to practice their tutoring, to become better at their prodding of students and asking the right kinds of questions and acting as a tutee in various, places in their knowledge so that the tutor becomes better and more skilled at helping the student learn and get more comfortable with their knowledge and with the tasks that are being asked of them. What we focus on specifically is the relationship between the tutor and the tutee and how that relationship can build trust and build more opportunities for growth. When that isn't there, the students are less likely to turn to a virtual tutor when they are really stuck and the explanations aren't helping. It's hard to say something like, oh, I still don't get it. The AI doesn't care. It's very it doesn't get tired. So you can keep asking it to explain it to you in a different way or explain it to me in this way. So there's many opportunities there as well. But I do think that we really can't forego the relationship altogether between the tutor and the tutee. And I do also see a place that we can leverage the AI to provide some supports and support systems. And I remember a couple of years ago, it was before ChatGPT and before all of the explosion of AI. But I was working with teachers, and I saw that they had an Alexa in their classroom, and the Alexa that they had, it was a second grade classroom, and the Alexa was in the corner, and Alexa was there to help spell words and to help with math problems. And so the students could go over and whisper to Alexa, "Hi, Alexa, how do you spell confidence?" And Alexa would whisper back, CONF, right? And so what now we have is like everyone has that little Alexa or that potential for that tutor or that help just in that moment in their hands potentially. In many schools now, they're limiting the amount of AI that students have access to, but increasing the amount of AI that teachers have access to, but they still have the Alexas in their classroom. So how can we make sense of when we use those tools, when we rely on the human connection? And I'd love to hear a little bit more about others' perspectives on that as well.
Well, that's fascinating too, because there's some newer companies that are emerging. One is a group primarily came out of the IBM Watson Education Group, and a company called Merlin. And basically, what that is a teacher's assistant. So doing some of exactly the type of thing that you're talking about, effectively and intelligent train the trainer kind of work. And also, I think the sense of, where this kind of is involved with professional development. We often think about the focus on the student, but sometimes it's about the focus on doing the PD. And I've always found both, when I taught full time both in language arts at the high school level, and then communication at the university level. I found that we often had a lot of challenges on the PD side, because you'd say, Where am I supposed to find the time?" Right? But everybody talks about they're offering PD. It's not about offering PD, or even if it make it free. It's when am I going to do it? Because I have no more time in my schedule.
Yeah. And the best PD in the world has no impact if it doesn't get implemented in the classroom. We can talk about all of this stuff for days and days at a time, but if the teachers aren't going to go back, if they don't see a way to go back into their classrooms and use it and implement new things, have the flexibility and the collaborative time and all of that to really go back and see how it works for their students and adapt it, then it doesn't have the impact that we want it to have. And, with the work that we're doing, we're really focused on that implementation piece as well, because that's where it gets tweaked, it gets adapted, and the impact is felt in the classroom.
I think the other thing too that's different, certainly when I was teaching in K to 12 with the internet and with online, is so much of this stuff you can have store and forward, and so you can use it at your leisure, right? So to speak. But it could be at 1 in the morning, and you just got done with your lesson plans and correcting your papers for the next day, and if you're still awake, you could actually do it then. Um, so, Cole, that also reminds me, back in the early days of Carnegie Learning, when I would visit classrooms, and I remember some of the teachers had structured a different style of classroom, where the students were actually around the perimeters of the room. It wasn't rows and columns, and so that they could kind of more facilitate. And I remember they often would tell the kids, if you have a question, put your name up on the board, kind of in order, and I'll get around to you. And what often would happen in the meantime, is that sometimes through grit and persistence, the student would figure it out and so take their name off the board. And sometimes the peer-to-peer support kicked in, and the kid next to them helped explain it, and they got it, and were able to move forward with the program. And sometimes they were still stuck, but those kids, the teacher was able to get to and give more personal human, touch and one-to-one tutoring. And so it was fascinating how that combination of resource, whether it was peer-to-peer or whether it was from the system or whether it was the teacher could then focus on the kids who needed it the most, and as opposed to all of us, in the past, were focused on teaching to the middle, and the kids on either end got short shrift. Um, but I was going to raise the question also, Cole, is that I know from learning about your background that you had taught developmental reading to college age students, and I thought what was interesting. These were students who had been accepted at the City University in New York, often referred to as CUNY, um, but they had very poor reading skills, and so had to go through a developmental reading course before they could even handle challenging college curricula. Um, so I'm wondering, when you were doing that work with older struggling readers, did you discover any insights by working with these older students that would help parents and teachers and even ed tech product developers um, on how to work with students when they're at the early stages of learning, as opposed to getting all the way to the college level and have to learn how to read?
Yeah, those are both of your comments there are big questions, and I hope you don't mind. I do want to respond to what you said at first about when you were early on at Carnegie Learning, watching those classrooms, because one of the things I think is so cool that's happening right now in ed tech, and it's becoming more and more accessible, is we're able to provide more support to teachers who are trying to help students who are working through these kind of individualized or personalized learning software. So like the student is working kind of at their own pace, but they're struggling. And the key thing I wanted to mention there is the student who goes to put their name on the board because they're struggling is not always the student who the teacher needs to talk to. It's not, sometimes students put their name on the board and they need to have that, as you said, they might through their own grit, and they might work their way through it, and they might actually just need to kind of struggle productively for a little while. But there's another student who's struggling unproductively and doesn't want to put their name on the board. And one of the things we're working on right now is actually using augmented reality by giving teachers glasses that will let them see their students' progress in the software, and let them see who might be struggling unproductively, so that they can go over to that student and help them. And it's not so much on the student to have that metacognitive recognition, which can be hard to develop at a very young age, especially we're talking about elementary school, for kids to recognize, oh, I need help. But speaking to your other question as well, yeah, I taught these students. They were so CUNY City University accepts all students into their community college program. So that means you get a wide range of levels. And I did have a lot of students who struggled with reading comprehension they could struggle at a range of levels, but some of them it was quite severe. And I thought a lot about what these students needed, and it's why I actually pursued to study cognitive psychology. And ultimately, I think it really comes down to things that what makes a student a good reader when they're an adult is things that happen when they're 2 years old. It's being read to. So I think we often think of reading starts with learning the alphabet. Reading doesn't start with learning the alphabet. Reading starts with learning how to hear tiny units of sound. We as humans are not wired to read. That was not something that we needed to do 60,000 years ago. But so we do not naturally develop the ability to hear the difference to hear like Cat. It is to pronounce cats or and so we have to acquire this, and it starts when we're reading to kids. We read to them. The children's books are often written in such a way that they draw attention to these tiny units of sound. And so kids start to pick up on this and they start to hear these sounds. They also start to expand their vocabulary. So vocabulary expands much more rapidly through when kids are exposed to reading. There's a lot more diversity in the words that they're exposed to. And kids, when they're that age, they like reading. They want to bring their parents or their caretakers or whoever is with them. They want to bring them a book, and they want to be read to. So it's a experience that their first experience with reading then is exciting. It's fun. And that needs to be sustained as well. And that's really important, because once they get into school, they might have to read about topics that they're not so interested in. And that kind of fun side of reading dies out, and they start to think, well, I don't like reading. That's even worse. That's even more exaggerated if when they get to school, they're also just now at kindergarten developing phonetic awareness. So developing awareness of those tiny parts of sounds. Then they're a little bit behind their peers. They're also not going to be reading at the same level as their peers, so they're not going to be developing the same level of vocabulary. And this gap just widens and widens and widens as kids get older, until you start to have kids who they really develop an identity around, I'm not a reader, I don't read, and they just push it away and they try to avoid it as much as possible. And so I do think it starts at that very, very young age. And I do think it's really hard for technology to do anything. That what those kids need is someone to read to them. They need a person to read to them. But as they get a little bit older, as they get into school, the technologies that can start to use speech recognition with children. So this is actually more difficult than people may think. We can understand adults really well. You can talk to your Alexa, but Alexa, you're talking about kids can kind of go over there, but Alexa has a little bit of a harder time understanding a child than it does an adult. And so we really need to be working on those technologies so that we can hear children, not just the words they say, but how they say them, so that we can understand where they might be struggling with their kind of phonetic awareness, or where they might be confusing things, whether it's during their regular speech, when they're even 4 years old, or whether it's when they're reading words when they're a little bit older.
Can I add something to this?
Yes.
Which is, I think, what you're talking about in terms of like lap reading, and when children begin to develop, that relationship with reading and an interest in it, what's exciting about it is the story, sure, but it's also the relationship with the parent. And AI can read to you and Alexa can read to you, but you can't sit on Alexa's lap, right? Like there is a certain shared kind of familiarity in the reading, that it's not just about the book. And yes, the colors are there, and yes, everything is there broken down into those pieces to help you learn. But a lot of kids, they come over, they bring you a book, and they turn right around and they want to sit right down on your lap and they want to look at that with you. And it's the talking about it and the holding of the book. And AI can support parents in creating time for those rituals and those routines. You can sit together and read and listen alongside AI, or alongside your Alexa, or whatever that would be. But the relationship and what you're bringing up with this is such an important thing, that creates the desire and that the reason that kids are so drawn to reading in the first place when they're little. It's about learning, in that environment.
And I'll just continue that too, because I think that relationship, it needs to continue. So it's the child's first exposure. In this unit where I live, we're readers. We do this. This is part of who we are. And one thing that can happen is if kids drift away from reading and start to say, well, I'm not a reader, well, they start to kind of be around a lot of people who also say, I'm not a reader. And then if they want to go to college, they want to pursue this kind of higher level of learning where they have to access text. Now it's not just that they need to learn to pick up on all these skills that we would have hoped that they would have acquired earlier, but that they also have to change their identity. And I think that it can be easy to think like, well, as they get to be stronger readers, they'll change their identity. But in my experience, it was the other way around. They had to change their identity before they could ever become a stronger reader. And it's really hard to change an adult's identity. It's really complicated. It's really tricky. Even if the person is, is showing up in class and, wants to go to college, it's still hard to have them say, yeah, I am a reader. I can read, and I can find enjoyment in this, or I can develop mastery of this.
It's interesting. I discovered after managing a lot of salespeople over uh, many years um, that there was a segment of salespeople who were very um, advanced in their oral skills. And if you asked them to present a monthly report, it was awful. Their reading and writing abilities, and today we're getting better and better at diagnosing learning disabilities earlier. But I'm convinced that many of those folks, they defaulted to the oral, and they became oral intellectuals while they were, fairly ignorant at the reading and writing levels. It's fascinating, and there's many anecdotal stories out there of people who are basically illiterate with their reading and writing skills who have been successful as real estate salespeople and whatever and other elements and found and sometimes even their spouses found out later on that they couldn't read at all. So I have two brother-in-laws that were diagnosed later with severe dyslexia, and they were just treated as being unintelligent. One was 14 when they finally diagnosed him, and probably had no better than a third grade education. And I think, we're now and technology is assisting in some of the diagnostics of some of these things. And we're able to, even with programs like Carnegie Learning, you're able to the teacher can start to identify those people at earlier stages.
Yeah, absolutely. And and again, even with dyslexia, it does come back to uh, this ability to map, to hear the phonemes and to distinguish between phonemes. Dyslexia is not a reading disorder. It is first and foremost, it is a difficulty with these small units of sound. And there are other things as well, but then that manifests as a reading disorder um, later. And yeah, so I think that these kind of really developing these technologies that can really engage with kids before reading to understand what difficulties they may have if they have a learning disability that may then later cause problems can help a lot, because we don't want to find that out once kids are starting to read. So we don't want them to fall behind, because that like I said, that vocabulary gap, that's enormous. Once we get past reading acquisition, once the phonetic mapping is there, the students have to be able to develop that large vocabulary. When they start to fall behind there, then we were really in trouble.
Well, one of the other things you mentioned reminded me of some of the research that was going on at Carnegie Mellon before people had much knowledge about natural language processing and some of the um, speech recognition software. And CMU was on the forefront of independent speech recognition. I remember them, really with the stuff that Jack Mostel used in Project Listen and some of those other projects at Carnegie Mellon was about how do you deal with foreign accents and different types of dialect and female voices versus more lower register male voices was a problem. And I remember there were practical issues because they were getting funded by the car companies, right? And so if you couldn't turn your car on and off with voice, if you were a woman, that would be a problem, right? Or put the window down. And I remember some of the testing and experiments they did related to independent speech. Um, so um, Conrad, I wanted to get back to something, you made some reference to in your earlier comments because I think it's probably important for some of the parents and community people. But I do remember also with some of the AI based work, and you talked about the caregivers, about goal setting and some of the other kind of tactics that perhaps you can speak to for parents in support of their learners and maybe what considerations when they're dealing with AI supported tutoring.
Sure, happy to speak to that. And I quite resonate with some of the things that were mentioned earlier regarding, retaining the human element in things like, reading to a child, for instance. And similar things are true when you look at individualized math learning software and homework, which is a context that I research. In that context, we often study, and this is kind of prefacing some of the goal setting things, how the attention of teachers or remote tutors on Zoom that help students in their homework correlates to their persistence and during math learning. And we found that when students disengage or struggle, for instance, to learn, that these short visits to the learners and the human attention that they bring often has quite substantial boosts to student persistence and learning in these systems. So because we know that not only teacher time, but also parent and caregiver time is constrained, yeah, we developed techniques and models of goal setting that similarly introduce touch points during the students' math learning and practice, where, for instance, you start out with a bit of a contract almost between the student and the parent. So this could be a piece of paper where they jointly reflect on, how many minutes of math practice does the child want to complete this week or is able to complete? And then data from the educational technology is used to check in on that goal at the end of the week and introduce that touch point where the parent says, okay, you did your goal. Let me reward you with something you like. Or maybe the student didn't meet the goal quite as much, and then there's maybe a conversation about adjusting the goal or thinking about strategies to adjust practice in a subsequent week. And so, yeah, in my research, I've developed systems that scaffold and organize and structure these conversations, also between teachers and students, as well as these remote Zoom-based tutors that we study called hybrid tutors in math classrooms. And they've shown to not only make it more likely for students to experience success and meet their goals by kind of using data to adjust goal targets, but also, yeah, boost engagement and ultimately the proficiency that students attain in these systems in math. And so, yeah, I'd say when we think about AI, it's worth also thinking a lot about how they can scaffold and orchestrate maybe human processes that matter for learning, as opposed to only doing the math tutoring. And so, yeah, we increasingly see a development in our field to design and use such ecosystems and develop these systems. And I'm excited to see where we could head with emerging tools like language models like ChatGPT that I mentioned. And since, as mentioned, we haven't really figured out how to use these tools productively and out of the box, they tend to provide too much support, too much maybe induce over reliance. And so, yeah, I'm excited to keep developing in this space.
Yeah, I'm really wondering, how in some of these areas, when I was doing research in graduate school, I did a good bit of focus on ironically with attention and 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 the dearth of research that was there about attention, right? And now almost like things like ADHD seem epidemic. Um, and and uh, and so, we on one hand we talk about grit, right? But kids that have these attention challenges, grit's almost like, that's secondary to what they're dealing with, on a day-to-day basis. And I remember that one of the few places that there was, some pretty interesting research was with air traffic controllers because, they're the attention that they have to play to. I don't know if any of you have ever visited one of the sites of that does that. If you saw how many dots were on the screen of how many planes are in the sky at one time, you'd never fly again. And the fact that people have to pay attention to all those dots and what's going on with them as a matter of their work is just boggling to me. And so we take that down to the classroom level, and you think about some of those kids who have learning challenges, due to things like ADHD or dyslexia or name it. It makes you really um, think about how complex the challenge is for the teacher, right, in those classrooms, or with the parent who maybe doesn't have even some of the insights that the teacher has about kids that might be struggling, and this isn't because of intelligence. That was another thing with Carnegie Learning that the diagnostic parts that was a surprise to me to find out is that most kids have a lot of math knowledge. It's highly fragmented because they had a teacher that perhaps wasn't as strong in that subject matter, or they changed schools and missed some core concepts, or they were looking out the window at the wrong time. And so they missed foundational pieces, but then got them reinforced by parents and by others that, well, you don't have a math brain, right? You're just like me. And so um, I think the piece that I think is also interesting that I'd be fascinated for any of you to comment on, the technology that's come into the educational system isn't just um, intelligent tutoring, right? There's a lot of other tools and a lot of other platforms that you're probably coming in contact with, and I was interested in other thoughts you have about where technology is playing a role in some of the things that you're observing and experiencing with your work. And anybody can jump in.
Well, I can say I know during COVID, there was an explosion of technology that was being used. And I think there was a graph that a think tank and research institution put out that showed like this huge just spike in the number of tools that were being used. And I think that there was an average of 40 tools, technology tools, that each individual teacher was using, either in like direct classroom instruction or as like in on the back end, like school, like an learning management system, some sort of teacher tools. And that's a lot to manage, and that's a lot to really utilize well. Sometimes I think, if it, for some people, it's enough to have like a couple good things in their in their toolbox. And what occurs to me all the time, and what I always see, and I go to lots of different conferences and I meet lots of entrepreneurs and ed tech investors and people who are really interested in finding the thing, the solution. I've heard so much recently about people wanting not just to create a tool, but to create a platform, to create something that encompasses a lot of different tools together. And that instead of, bringing in a little bit of this and a little bit of that, that there's a cohesive approach where things work together more seamlessly. And I think that is a great idea, a great approach. But if that's the case, everybody can't be creating a platform, right? Because that's just going to fragment even more. And in Pennsylvania, we have we have local decisions on everything from curriculum to technology tools to the LMS that is being used in the classroom, to the books that teachers can bring into their curriculum, or who chooses what books are there. So we really have an emphasis on local control. And so each individual district gets to choose what tools they use and how they use them. And so it does lead to some fragmenting in the market, but it also gives great opportunity to new entrepreneurs who have ideas to bring forward, and a chance for them to make sense of what it actually looks like in the classroom. Because oftentimes, what somebody dreams up is actually implemented in a bit of a different way when it comes to like a true third grade classroom, or a high school social studies classroom, or a home ec classroom, an FCS classroom, or in the library. So the way that things are implemented might be a little bit different in practice than they are in theory. And so, I know that there's great promise in these tools to leverage student knowledge and attention, give teachers back some planning time, and to allow them to build more of those meaningful relationships with students and do the things that, AI and technology can't do. Um, but I know that there's more emphasis now on making good decisions for the students and for the teachers in a way that is not necessarily adding more and more and more, but saying, okay, we have 40 tools. We can't use all of them. How are we making a good decision about what we need? And I see a lot of districts engaging teachers in those conversations, and parents in conversations about what types of technology they can use at home with their students, and how that might be a value add in homework or whatever that is. So I always encourage conversations beyond just making a decision about, oh, this is the newest thing that integrates all this. Well, how does it actually work in the classroom? And is this something where we're willing to invest the time and energy into implementing it with fidelity? Because if not, then it's just another fancy thing in our wheelhouse that, if we can't use it well, just ends up sitting there and not making the impact that it can or should.
Yeah,
I think
go ahead. Go ahead.
I was just gonna, I agree with all of that. And I think one of the key things you're talking about there is like the tools that allow parents to work with children, that allow teachers to work with children, not the tools that work with the children. Like the teacher is important in that, the parent is important in that. And um I think sometimes we see, because there's teacher shortages, that the ed tech tool is, becoming more and more of the teacher. And that's not the way, in my opinion, the best ed tech tools are designed to work. They're designed to be to include that social component that kids need, just like the child needs the parent to be on the lap of the parent. The child needs the teacher. They need them there. And I think we're seeing another big boom. We saw a big boom in the pandemic. We're seeing a big boom with generative AI. But I think some of the exciting solutions are going to be the ones that create more community within the classroom, that give kids more opportunity for social learning, that give parents more opportunity to interact with their kids, teachers more opportunity to see and help their students. I don't have a specific example off the top of my head, but those are the ones I'm looking for, and those are the ones that we're trying to, develop within our own company.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think sometimes, surprisingly, well, maybe not surprisingly, but higher ed stuff trickles down. And, quite a few years ago, they realized when they used to separate academic computing from administrative computing, but there was a lot of relationship there that was being missed by keeping those things as silos and separate. And because of the nature of K to 12 being, I call it a 50-headed monster at best, because every state runs their own educational system. I think it's a bigger challenge. Also, we've rewarded K-12 for innovation, but not for replication. And you get something good, and you don't see it done a second time because the rewards aren't there for replication. And so that's another area. We're getting close to the end, and so I wanted to thank Lauren and the Carnegie Library of Pittsburgh for hosting and for setting up this series of webinars. I think it's great, and as usual, it raises more questions than we get answers, because I know I have a list here that I would have liked to have asked. So you all stimulated that, and I hope the people who listen to this, find that this makes them more curious and more interested in learning more. So thank you all. And I also wanted to mention quickly that that the next one of these panels is going to be on November the 19th from 4 to 5 in the afternoon Eastern Standard Time, and it's titled Schools and Libraries. And so I think it'll be another interesting one to pass on to others to tune into. So thank you all for participating, and thanks to the Carnegie Library of Pittsburgh.
Awesome. Thank you, Bob, and thank you, Cole, Laura, and Conrad. This was a great discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you for including me.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much.